We are not excluding the possibility of military intervention. This remark came from an AOA representative during a sudden gathering in Abuja, Nigeria. The objective is clear. The Sahel Alliance, AES, directed by three military figures, Traoré Amagita and Abdulrahman Tani, what began as a coalition to fight terrorism is now being blamed for disrupting regional stability. Yet in Burkina Faso, it's seen as a rare moment of African self-rule. No bullets have been discharged. Still, global media has framed it as a march toward war. Imagine being a citizen of a nation that just broke free from domination, only to be told to return to its previous structure. How would you react? Following a string of coups between 2021 and 2023, the three nations Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger withdrew from ECOWAS, the West African Economic Bloc, and launched the Sahel Alliance AES in early 2024. They defined it as a defense pact, free from influence by France, the EU, or any foreign power. ECOWAS didn't wait to respond. By February 2024, it declared it would not acknowledge AES's existence and demanded that former members rejoin the democratization track, supervised by international observers. French news outlets labeled this stance as a warning for traitors, while Algerian media called it a sovereignty crisis disguised in legal terms. So what's your opinion? Does a regional union possess the authority to impose old frameworks on sovereign members, or should every nation decide its own path forward? Underneath all the diplomatic posturing is a sharp contest of strategy. Each party sees itself as the protector of order, painting the other as a threat to the continent's stability. After AES's announcement, ECOWAS convened several emergency summits. Publicly, these were about reinstating regional order. Privately, the bloc was fractured. Nigeria, with the most influence, feared that AES's split might inspire other military regimes. If we let armed governments succeed, said one top official, every democratic institution in West Africa could crumble. In contrast, Ghana and Senegal raised alarms over military action. They warned it could lead millions into deeper poverty and chaos. You cannot bomb a people's sovereignty and then name it peace. Within ECOWAS, arguments raged. Underneath it all was Western pressure, mainly from France and the EU. Worried about their fading clout in the Sahel, AES's termination of military relations with France, expulsion of troops, and cancellation of bilateral deals has infuriated. Paris. One leaked document revealed France's strong push for ECOWAS to crack down on coulette states, even offering logistical aid for a potential strike. Yet, for the people of Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali, this is an ultra-familiar scene, a new version of indirect rule. Meanwhile, AES's leadership has chosen silence in response to ECOWAS threats. No dramatic press briefings, no fiery words, just intensified border coordination, preparation for their first collective military drill, and one unified statement: we do not seek war, but we will not kneel. A single image went viral across social platforms. The three presidents, Traoré, Goita, and Tiani, clasped hands in the desert. Below the image, a simple caption read, "We are not betraying anyone, we are just returning to ourselves." Questions didn't just stir inside official meetings, they spilled into the streets of Lagos, Accra and Dakar, cities once seen as anchors of regional stability. Are we supporting the right side? A small poll published by African Novel revealed that 43% of Nigerians surveyed opposed military action against AES despite their government's tough posture. One shopkeeper in Abidjan told a journalist, "We don't know politics very well, but if Traoré can give his people more safety, land, electricity, what's the harm in that?" This kind of sentiment left ECOWAS governments in a dilemma. Once confident they spoke for the people, they now feared they were losing that very mandate. The image of young leaders boldly rejecting the old system held a certain power. Ironically, ECOWAS was born to shield the region from violence, yet now it teeters on the edge of sparking it. The moral authority it once held is now under scrutiny, not because its ideals have failed, but because its behavior no longer fits the era. Behind closed doors in Lome, a Ghanaian delegate rose and objected. "We cannot hide behind the word peace to protect outdated interests. A body that doesn't evolve becomes an empire." That quote rippled outward. A group of intellectuals in Benin published an open letter to ECOWAS asking why only AES is being told to return to democracy when many other member states also commit human rights abuses that go unchallenged. The signs of bias, inconsistency, and outside influence are pulling ECOWAS closer to a dangerous edge. This is no longer just a question of regional order, but a deeper crisis of legitimacy. And while ES governments brace for the worst, the people of their nations show support in quiet, powerful ways. There is no violence, no chaos, just silent resolve. AES flags appear on electric poles, front doors, even tied to the backs of buffalo plowing fields as quiet declarations of defiance. This is a struggle for the right to shape one's own destiny. And then, in the thick of this quiet tension, Traoré ended the silence not with rhetoric, but with bold, surprising moves that forced the entire region to pay attention. Would you walk away from a powerful bloc to start again, alone? There would be risk, there would be isolation. But is independence worth that cost? While ECOWAS still scrambles to unify its message, While headlines warn of uprisings, villagers near the borders go on plowing fields, raising schools, rebuilding after conflict, because for them, politics only matters when it touches their soil, their meals, and the safety of their children. And then amid that same undercurrent, Traoré once more shattered the silence, not with declarations, but with undeniable action. As international headlines and ECOWAS member states continued to argue about the AES threat in Ouagadougou, Bamako and Niamey, the reality shifted. No fiery speeches, no dramatic press events, only action. On June 15th, all three AES governments jointly signed an order to restructure their military forces. Each nation dispatched an elite unit to the Sahel Triangle to take part in a unified drill called Sahel Shield. This wasn't just training, it was a direct signal. We are prepared to defend ourselves. Ibrahim Traoré stood there himself, in full uniform, no security detail, shaking hands with every soldier. In a moment that spread rapidly across social media, Traoré said, "People ask why we are not afraid." His reply was simple: because, for the first time in our history, we stand on this land without anyone guiding us. Simultaneously, local administrations were instructed to create early warning systems along borders with Nigeria and Benin, two countries that still stand firmly with ECOWAS, though it wasn't spoken aloud. The message was understood. They were preparing for every scenario, including the possibility of conflict. But it's worth highlighting, these steps weren't carried out with military parades or loud declarations. They were part of a broader public initiative named Security Self-Reliance. If you were staring down the threat of outside intervention, would you wait or begin building your own defensive line now? And how should a government communicate such actions without sowing panic among its people? The most notable feature of the AES response wasn't its military posture, it was the way it brought people together. Not through fear, but through unity. In Burkina Faso, community radio stations began airing a program titled Citizenship in Transition. Farmers, teachers, students, ordinary voices were invited to share their thoughts on independence, economic resistance, and above all, their faith in this new leadership. A primary school teacher from the Kaya area said over the airwaves, "For the first time, I see a government that doesn't just talk, but acts. Even if things are hard, I choose to stay in class because the children's future matters more than fear." Soon, Sovereignty Week was rolled out across all three AES nations. Students painted national landscapes, youth cleaned city streets, and volunteers organized outdoor screenings of historical films. In viral images, people raised three fingers symbolizing Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, not as protest, but as one united message. We don't want war, but we won't retreat. In Niger, crowds also gathered for outdoor prayers asking for peace, not because the state told them to, but because they believed in something larger than politics. Every Friday, churches and mosques came together in a show of unity. The picture of a struggling nation holding its head high, trusting in a force greater than power or policy, moved many to tears. What stood out even more, AES authorities did not suppress criticism. Independent outlets were still publishing pieces, questioning the speed of militarization and expressing concern over national policy. Yet there were no arrests, no censorship, and that stunned observers more than anything. Outside the region, Western analysts began sounding alarms. What if these three nations, once dismissed as incapable of governing, succeeded in building self-sufficiency? The very idea challenges the foundation of the system France and the EU have long supported. Can a state grow stronger by placing trust in its citizens rather than controlling them? And can the AES model of independence survive without foreign financial aid? But just as AES seemed to find its internal footing, a sudden blow came from beyond, threatening to undo everything. ECOWAS struck not with tanks or soldiers, but with pressure that was quieter and more punishing than guns: economic and diplomatic sanctions. On July 2nd, ECOWAS announced a partial trade embargo on the AES bloc. Regional banks were directed to freeze all transactions to and from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Borders with Nigeria and Benin were tightened. Supplies of fuel, medicine, and food began to pile up at inspection posts. ECOWAS officially described these steps as precautionary, designed to pressure the coup regimes back into the democratic fold. But the reality hit elsewhere, first not in presidential offices, but in poor villages dependent on open borders. In rural Niger, one woman named Ada told a local reporter, "I used to walk into Nigeria to buy salt and soap. Now I have to pay 3 times as much, and even then, I'm not sure I'll get anything." Said Ada, "My kids are starting to fall sick because there's no medicine." But this was only the beginning. Alongside ECOWAS, both France and the European Union pressured global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank to freeze funding to AES countries. Their justification: the political environment was unstable, too risky for continued support. As a result, a range of projects from water infrastructure to agricultural aid and poverty relief were put on indefinite hold. It was a double blow. The EES governments had to operate with already scarce resources, while ordinary people were crushed by rising prices. Analysts dubbed it a slow burn strategy. Instead of launching an invasion, they turned the economy into a weapon, hoping the suffering population would rise against their own governments. Can a regional bloc justify using its own citizens as leverage, all in the name of democracy? Would you support sanctions if the first people to suffer were the poor, not the powerful? But that wasn't the end of it. When economic strangulation, we didn't deliver the intended collapse, a new plan surfaced this time, not from outside, but from within. The second wave of pressure was more psychological. Media outlets across the region suddenly buzzed with anonymous leaks and shadowy reports, claiming internal cracks inside. AES rumors swirled that Mali was frustrated with Traoré's dominance over AES communication channels, or that Niger was being sidelined from key decision-making. None of these reports were confirmed, and each was swiftly denied by the AES governments. But their aim wasn't to prove anything, it was to plant doubt in the minds of citizens. To weaken unity, AES's strongest asset. The offensive didn't end with media manipulation. ECOWAS quietly encouraged the revival of old opposition groups. In each AES country, political parties and figures once removed from power. Independent journalists began tracking financial trails leading from Lagos and Paris to these so-called pro-democracy movements operating underground in Burkina Faso. The result, small protests started to break out in capital cities for a return to civilian rule. They weren't large, but they were enough for international outlets to grab headlines. AES is splintering. Faced with this new type of pressure, the AES governments responded quickly. They increased monitoring of foreign money flows, imposed tighter rules on NGOs, and launched a transparency and trust campaign in citizens to public forums on autonomy, economics, and national security. Still, experts warn, ECOWAS's constant provocations might trigger not just a broader regional conflict, but also internal instability in countries where social cohesion rests entirely on public trust and resilience. Who really wins in a crisis where both sides are losing the faith of their own people? If democracy is the stated goal, why use information warfare to divide? But just when it looked like the situation was spiraling beyond recovery, something unexpected occurred. Not from ECOWAS, not from the West, but from another long silent forced arrest of Africa. While attention remained fixed on the standoff between West Africa and AES, a surprising development unfolded in Libreville, Gabon. During an extended session of Samakaya coalition of Central African countries, the president of Gabon stood alongside representatives from Chad, the Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Equatorial Guinea to make a statement that was brief, yet powerful. We support the autonomy of all African nations in choosing their path of development. They didn't name they didn't need to. Everyone understood it was a subtle yet unmistakable gesture of solidarity. Only days later, delegations from AES were invited to a closed-door meeting in Bangui, Central African Republic. There, President Faustin Touadéra, who had successfully defended his country against both rebels and foreign pressure, proposed something new, a forum for Africans, a network of nations, outside ECOWAS and the Central African Economic Community, committed to mutual support in security, commerce, and energy. It was a counterattack, quiet but strategic hand. It changed the game. AES was no longer standing alone, and ECOWAS was no longer the only regional voice with political weight. Quietly, new players began entering the scene. Russia, Turkey, and even Brazil reopened diplomatic back channels with AES, expressing interest in long-term partnerships in solar energy and mineral development. There were no press conferences, no grand announcements, but the message was unmistakable. AES might be forming a new axis of cooperation, one no longer anchored to the global north. What happens to the world order if African nations begin to move in unison, not under instruction but by their own will? If you led a small but free country, would you stay silent, or would you speak like Gabon did? Yet, for all of AES's maneuvering, there was one move no one saw coming. Not ECOWAS, not its foreign allies. It began with a national broadcast aired simultaneously in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. There were no government figures, no official speeches, just the camera lens turning to the people. A Nigerian mother teaching her child to read the alphabet, tracing the letters in chalk on bare ground. A Malian teacher standing in a classroom with its roof bombed out. A young soldier in Burkina Faso, head bowed in prayer before patrol. No accusations, no anger, no rallying cry, just images, just lives. Within 24 hours, the video swept through social media, reaching millions under a single phrase, #BUBAN, we not Boeing. Artists and academics in Congo, Angola, even Senegal posted their support. An exiled journalist wrote, "We are watching a counteroffensive made of faith, not bullets of truth and quiet dignity." ECOWAS had no response, no new statements, no emergency briefings, no retaliatory sanctions. Because once the battle becomes symbolic, traditional weapons lose their meaning. What makes a government truly strong? Its defense budget or its ability to stand on truth. And if you had the chance to send a message that would echo through history, what would you tell your children or grandchildren? Despite AES's moral victory in the court of public opinion, the greatest challenge remains. How do you preserve peace when the world itself is fracturing? In every conflict, the strongest side doesn't always win, but those who stay rooted in truth always leave a mark. When these three young leaders stepped away from the old world order, they didn't just start a new movement. They asked the question millions had avoided for generations: who decides the future of Africa? In villages far from city lights, where prayer replaces policy, people ask for little education for their children, food on their tables, and the chance to live with the dignity that God placed on this land from the beginning. Maybe, just maybe, that quiet hope, not declarations, not sanctions, what can change everything. One day your children will read about this in their textbooks. What will they learn? How will it end? If it were up to you, what future would you help write? Can justice, truth, and faith in God exist within politics? Leave your answer below, because sometimes that's how the future begins.